The Security Council has been holding an emergency meeting over the escalating tensions in Syria. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged all parties to exercise restraint and to avoid any further escalation. Now, this comes after the US, the UK and France launched airstrikes in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack in Syria.
The Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I call on the members of the Security Council to unite and exercise that responsibility. And I urge all members to show restraint in these dangerous circumstances and to avoid any acts that could escalate matters and worsening the suffering of the Syrian people.
Well, let's go live now to the UN headquarters where that emergency meeting is taking place. Syria's representative is currently speaking. Let's listen in.
بريطانيا والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية قاموا بالعدوان على بلادي باسم المجتمع الدولي. هيك قال. La communauté internationale.
That the aggression of his country,
أنا
along
أريد
with the
أن
United Kingdom and the
أستفسر
United States,
عن
was
أي
carried
مجتمع
out on
دولي
behalf of the international
يتحدث
community.
زميلي السفير الفرنسي.
And
هل
if that is
يتحدث
the
عن
case, I
مجتمع
wonder
دولي موجود؟
which international community is he speaking of? Is he
فعلاً؟
speaking of a real international
هل
community
هذا
that
المجتمع
actually
الدولي الذي
exists?
تمثلونه أنتم
Is that
وافق
international
على أن تقوم
community that
هذه
you
الحكومات
represent?
الثلاث بالعدوان على بلادي؟ هل
Has it
حصلت هذه
authorized
الحكومات
this
الثلاث على تفويض من مجلس الأمن؟
trilateral or tripartite
ارتكاب
aggression against
العدوان
my
على
country?
بلادي؟
Did your governments receive a mandate from this organization from this international
زملائي
community to
السفراء
attack my country? My American and French and British colleagues.
Well, there you have the Syrian representative to the UN addressing the UN Security Council on the latest developments in the country. As we know, of course, Syria has strongly condemned the US-led action. Let's get you more now on these developments. I'm joined live from New York by our UN correspondent, Nick Harper. Nick, of course, we know that it was Russia that called this emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. And indeed, over the past hour or so, there's been some very strong statements coming out of that meeting. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, some very strong statements, and it really comes along the lines of whether or not these strikes were right. The United States, the UK and France have said that this was something that they had to do. They had to try and stop the chemical weapons regime from the Syrian government. However, the Russians coming to the defense of the Syrians, saying that they have gone against international law and violated the UN Charter. There is a particular article within the UN Charter, Chapter 7, which talks about the fact that unless military action is pre-authorized by the UN Security Council, then it cannot take place unless it is in self-defense. Now, Russia is saying that what we saw in terms of these airstrikes from the US, the UK and France, that was something that went against the terms of the UN Charter. We heard from Vasily Nebenzia. He is the Russian ambassador. He said that through their actions, the United States had made an already catastrophic humanitarian situation even worse. However, the US ambassador, Nikki Haley, said it was a justified, legitimate and proportionate response, and that the United States was locked and loaded should they need to strike again. As far as China goes, they said that it did seem as if the actions had violated the UN Charter and warned that it could now potentially handicap any peace deal within the Syrian conflict.
And indeed, we heard Secretary General Antonio Guterres say once again, or rather repeat the call for people to remain calm, to exercise restraint. Just how concerned is the UN that this could escalate further?
Well, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres seems very concerned. Remember, this was the second day running that he has had to speak to the UN Security Council about the situation in Syria. It is the fifth day this week that an emergency session has been held. The short version of his text was that yes, chemical weapons are abhorrent, but carrying out military intervention, the likes of which we saw overnight, undermined the UN Charter, and he said that if the law is ignored, it is undermined. He warned on Friday that there is potential for this to become a full-blown military escalation. So certainly concern coming from the top official at the United Nations, really urging calm, but also unity from all of the members of the Council.
And indeed, Nick, something else that came out of Russia's statement was that the chemical weapons watchdog experts and investigators have only just arrived in the country, in Syria, and have yet to complete their work. And that, of course, had begged the question of what justification the US and allies have had for carrying out these strikes before the watchdog was able to complete its work.
Well, yes, that's right. Yeah, the timing of these strikes has been criticised, it's been questioned. There's even been some confusion over the fact that this OPCW team arrived in the country during Thursday and Friday. They were due to start their work on Saturday. They say that they are still continuing with that mission to collect samples around Douma to see if there was an alleged chemical weapons attack that took place. But certainly some criticism that there was this military strike, despite the fact that we had that team in the country and they hadn't carried out the investigation. But the United States are saying that they have tried diplomacy time and time again. The US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, saying that on at least 6 occasions the Russian had vetoed resolutions that were put forward on chemical weapons, and that the time for talk was over, and instead it was time for action, justifying these strikes as really the only decision they could have made when it came to the issue of chemical weapons in Syria.
Well, Nick Harper, thanks very much for that update. Joining us there from New York, outside the UN headquarters.